You. One of the lucky things about right now, and granted it's a very short list, is that we don't have to rely, like Blanche Dubois, on the kindness of strangers. We can look inside the family and ask essential questions of our own people. Now, some of you may be new to the Episcopal Church. It may be news to you that not every congregation is able to pluck a former Assistant Secretary of the Treasury from its virtual pews to help us be smarter about shared challenges. Tim Massad, if you walk just a few blocks from St. Columba's, there are many, many places where you can see the effects of what's been going on since February and March. Empty storefronts that used to be homes to going concerns, shuttered restaurants and retail, office buildings with floors of unrented space, and nobody's coming up the escalator from the Tenleytown metro station. Lord and Taylor is closing, Neiman Marcus is closing. Two shopping malls stand on either side of Wisconsin Avenue, empty and quiet. The effects of the pandemic seem enormous, even in this little patch of America. Do we even have the tools to understand what's happening, how widespread the effects are, how many people are affected, and crucially, who's bearing the brunt of this pandemic-induced downturn?
Well, thank you, Ray. Yeah, let me try to answer that by hold on. I thought I would try to set this table with a few slides. You know, we're just a couple of weeks past Thanksgiving. It was a very different Thanksgiving for all of us. Many of us didn't travel to see family and friends. We had smaller gatherings. Maybe we cooked smaller turkeys. Maybe we didn't cook turkey at all. At the same time, if you want to look at what most Americans were saying about their situation, can you see the just before Thanksgiving slide? This is Census Bureau data. 1 in 6 adults with children said their household did not have enough food. 1 in 6 adults in rental housing reported difficulty paying rent. And 1 in 3 adults reported difficulty paying basic household expenses, food, rent or mortgage, car payments, medical. That was true for almost half of Black adults and Hispanic adults. It was true of households that represent 45% of the children in this country. So it's truly staggering statistics and evidence of the economic consequences of this pandemic. Another way to look at it is, of course, unemployment. These numbers may be more familiar to you. We lost 22 million jobs in April. We have recovered about half those, but the unemployment rate is still 6.7%. Now, 22 million, first of all, is about twice as many as we lost in the great financial crisis. Unemployment rates are higher for Black and Hispanic workers, and they are higher with those with less education. And of course, the unemployment rate does not even count those people who have given up working, or given up looking, excuse me. In DC, you know, many of us have gotten Zoom fatigue. We've tried to adjust to working remotely, but we are working remotely. So the job loss among higher wage workers, those people earning $60,000 or more, is only 6%. Among people who make less than $60,000 in DC, the job loss is around 20%. It's not quite as bad for the lowest wage workers, but still 18%. And by industry, we have seen a job loss in leisure and hospitality establishments in DC of almost half, 42%. Black, Hispanic, and less educated Americans have been disproportionately affected by this pandemic in multiple ways. First of all, they are more likely to have jobs that place them at greater risk. More than half of Black and Hispanic workers have jobs that must be done in person versus 41% for white workers. They have lower incomes. They are less likely to have health insurance. They are more likely to have pre-existing conditions. And they live in communities with weaker infrastructure. In some of the poorest neighborhoods of DC, of course, there are practically no grocery stores. Obviously, there aren't grocery stores that deliver groceries. You don't even have a grocery store you can go to. And more Black and Hispanic families, and often with less educated white workers, live in multi-generational households, and therefore there's more risk that one person gets exposed and then others do as well. Okay, so the government did act in the spring. You know, we came together, we overcame our partisan divisions, and the Congress enacted a series of measures, appropriated almost $3 trillion. And this is a summary of that. The principal areas are ones I'm sure you've heard about: the economic impact payments of $1,200 per person, $500 for children, unemployment insurance, help for small businesses, what are called the economic stabilization programs that the Treasury did for various businesses. And I'll just say a few words about each of these and some of the challenges in each of them. Looking at the economic impact payments, first of all, approximately 166 million payments were issued, totaling $275 billion, but there were problems. What the Treasury did was try to do direct deposit to as many people as possible. That means looking at people's tax returns for the direct deposit account they listed. But of course, many people don't list such an account. Many people did list an account, but it was a tax preparation firm's account. So there were about 25 million payments that went to the tax preparation firms and therefore took a while to get to the individuals. About 35 million payments were issued by check. Those literally took 4 to 5 months to reach people. Now, you know, we're talking about people who live paycheck to paycheck. Many of them were unemployed or furloughed. So to wait 4 to 5 months was really, really a tragedy. About 4 million were issued by prepaid debt card. Another 10 million that were probably eligible didn't receive anything because the Treasury didn't have any information for them. They tried then to send out notices to let people know they're eligible. Some people are still waiting. On unemployment insurance, most states, you know, provide at least 26 weeks. Some of them provide more than that. 3 federal programs were created under the CARES Act. One provided an additional 13 weeks of unemployment compensation for those who exhaust their regular unemployment at the state level. That expires the day after Christmas. A second provided unemployment insurance for people that weren't otherwise eligible. The self-employed, so-called gig workers, people who are furloughed. It's not always clear. It's a matter of state law as to whether if you're furloughed, you're entitled to unemployment compensation. That also expires the day after Christmas. And then the third program was an additional $600 a week in benefits for those receiving regular state unemployment or the CARES Act unemployment. That expired in July. President Trump also redirected 44 billion in FEMA funds. That has been exhausted as well. And there are problems in each of these areas that we can go into more as well. The small business, we did the Paycheck Protection Program. There was a lot of criticism of it on the eligibility standards. You know, it was there were complaints about the fact that some public companies got the money. Maybe there should have been a threshold, a maximum number of employees. Maybe there should have been a requirement to prove revenue loss. I look at this and say, the SBA got over 5 million loans out to small businesses. That was quite an accomplishment, totaling $530 billion. Most of those will be forgiven. They were badly needed. The impact on small business, as Ray started to discussed at the beginning, has just been huge. Again, the number of open small businesses in DC has declined by almost half. Now, in this case, open doesn't mean necessarily permanently closed, but it means businesses that are currently open for business. Let's see here. The economic stabilization programs, this was a series of programs that the Treasury did, support for the airlines industry, where they made loans or grants. And then they had $454 billion to support Federal Reserve programs. Now, the Fed on its own acted very quickly in March to stabilize financial markets. In mid-March, we had very serious strains in the financial markets, things that made all of us who had worked on the last financial crisis think, oh my God, are we in for another one? And the Fed stepped in and provided liquidity to the Treasury market, to other markets to arrest that. And I think that was the wise thing to do. In the CARES Act, Treasury was then given money to support additional Fed programs. And so the Fed launched programs to support the corporate debt and municipal debt markets, the Main Street lending market. Not much was really taken up in those facilities. That's not necessarily a bad thing. These facilities work in part by simply being there, although on the Main Street side, that one had some serious problems, and it didn't really have much of an impact. So, you know, these programs, I think, did calm financial markets. That was a good thing. And frankly, they contributed to what we now regard as the K-shaped recovery, right? For those of us, white-collar workers, people in the financial industry, people in corporate America who can work from home, the fact that the financial markets were calmed made it much easier. And obviously, any of us who have investments in the stock market has done quite well. It's really a staggering dichotomy here of people who have assets have actually, their wealth has grown, whereas many Americans who don't have assets, who have much less in the way of net worth, are facing terrible economic challenges. The Treasury has now discontinued those programs, however, which I think is unfortunate. Some of the Fed programs that it did on its own will continue. Finally, just to quickly look at what Congress is debating currently. As you know, they are debating another relief package. One version does not have direct payments to individuals. It does have unemployment insurance, further appropriations for that. Another version that the Trump administration proposed has the direct payments, but it doesn't have unemployment compensation. In any event, nothing is passed currently, so we're still waiting to see what happens there. Let me stop there, and we can get into a conversation now if I can just figure out how to end this sharing. There we go. Okay.
Well, Tim, one thing we know about the shape of the American economy is that far more people derive their sustenance from wages than from the income that's paid by dividends or appreciation of stock. Here we are at this moment where you've given us a really gruesome picture of the American economy for the many. And yet our stock market is at not just recovered, but bumping up against historic highs for all the indexes. What does it tell you about the American economy that the Dow is cresting at record levels while tens of millions of people are wondering if they're going to be able to pay their January rent?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think the way to explain the market is a couple of things. One, interest rates are very low, practically zero. So there's no other alternative, as people say, to stocks. People don't want to miss out. So, you know, number two, The fact that the Fed has been there to support financial markets has given private investors a lot of comfort. People said, well, okay, the Fed's going to be there. I'm going to keep my investments in. I'm not going to pull out. And number three, I think the stock market has been looking ahead to the vaccine and so forth. So yes, we've seen an incredible stock market given what is going on. But as you say, a lot of Americans don't benefit from that. I mean, by most estimates, about 15% have direct investments in the stock market, and maybe half of all Americans benefit from their 401ks or retirement plans. But about 10% of Americans probably own 80 to 85% of the value of the stock market. So it's again a reflection of the growing disparities in wealth. That coupled with just the nature of this pandemic has made this pandemic just so hard on Americans on the lower half of the income ladder.
But one place that tension is supposed to be addressed, released, is in our politics.
Absolutely.
Because the half of all Americans, that's 165 million people, who two Germanys, who are not benefiting, have representatives in the Senate and in the House who are shockingly still not coming up with answers for how they're going to survive, how they're going to manage their families between now and the time of vaccine at scale, which
Right.
will allow a lot of economic activity to continue. Just no answer.
Yeah.
Acting as if this is just sort of the conventional back and forth between Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, when the hot fires of real disaster are licking at the backs of some of these families. There is no surplus to draw on. There is no savings. The savings have already been emptied. It is astounding that politics has not had an answer, even though for many Americans, yes, the operation of the stock market has been wonderful.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. And there's so many different ways you can look at that. I mean, I was encouraged in March by the speed with which Congress came together and acted and passed the CARES Act. And that was great. But, we have hardly done anything since then. And the pandemic has gone on. When you look at how this has been dealt with in Europe, they have policies that are on the books already, so that in this situation, people received 70 to 85% of their paycheck automatically. We have a system where, you have to file for unemployment. That's at the state level. Those systems vary. A lot of them aren't that efficient. There were delays, there were problems. And then of course we have to rely on our Congress overcoming its dysfunction to provide additional assistance. And now we're in a situation where these programs are about to run out. Some of them have run out. The $600 extra ran out in July, and we're still debating. And, people said about the $600, oh, that's creating a disincentive for people to work. When you have 7%, 10% unemployment, that's just not a credible explanation, I think. Sure, there may be a few people who decided not to go back to work because of that. But the reason we did it as a set $600 is because we don't have the sophistication to pay people a percentage of their salary the way they do in Europe. If we had a system like that in place, then we could customize it, but we don't. We should. This pandemic has I think, revealed so many other weaknesses in our financial system that we can talk about. And on the net worth point that you brought up, people sometimes forget the average net worth of Americans is under $100,000. The average net worth for people without a high school diploma is $22,000. Half of all Americans, I think it's about half, can't afford or say they would have difficulty affording an unexpected $400 expense. So, this is the situation we're in.
At the time of the big meltdown in '08 and '09, I talked with a lot of economists about long tail challenges, how family balance sheets weren't just going to recover when things got back to normal and they got their 40 hours back or they found another job, that this was going to be something that cast a shadow on their balance sheets for years. Uh, is it fair to assume that some families were just getting traction again before all began, and now look out at the rest of the 2020s having to do another long-term repair job again?
Absolutely right. From 2009 to 2017, the economy added 16 million jobs. About 3 million, only about 3 million or so of those were for people without a college degree. Only 55,000 of those jobs were for people without a high school diploma. We had, though, in the last couple of years, seen some improvements there. We had seen improvements in Black, significant improvements in Black unemployment rates. We had seen improvements in median net worth for those people that were on the lower rungs of the income scale. But now we're faced with this, and when I think about the legacy of the financial crisis, I now think of it in this way. I think it was really the moment when many Americans stopped believing that the elites in government and business knew what they were doing and could, in fact, implement policies that would continue to improve conditions for people. The principles that many of us have believed in: globalization, free trade, technological advancement, that capitalism works, that democracy works. I think many people post-financial crisis became very skeptical of those because they saw a financial crisis where they suffered. But Wall Street didn't really suffer that much. Frankly, we did a good job of stabilizing the financial system and bringing it back, but we didn't do enough to help those on Main Street who were adversely affected. So that's the legacy I think we have for many people coming out of the financial crisis, and now this, where I think, frankly, it's a national tragedy that Congress hasn't done more.
If you read financial advice columns, when there's a big market downturn, as there was earlier this year, people are told, hey, don't do anything rash, hold your fire, don't sell. But when you have already run through everything in your savings accounts to pay your mortgage, and now you're going to be foreclosed, that's not advice that transfers. You can't not sell. Sometimes you have to sell just to avoid having what little chestnuts you have be immolated in the fire. That kind of effect is not just wait till the cycle turns and you'll be okay. That's the kind of thing that has, significant long-term consequences for an individual family. How long will it take for us to even get the full measure of what this year has meant for American families?
I think it's going to be a few years easily. I think you're absolutely right. And on the housing front, we haven't even touched on the specifics of that, but that's another issue where Congress needs to act. The CARES Act did have a moratorium on foreclosures for the GSE, the Fannie and Freddie loans, which represent a lot of mortgages, not all mortgages though. That will run out. They had a forbearance measure that is running out, where that you had to be granted a forbearance on your payments if you couldn't pay your Fannie or Freddie loan. The CDC issued an order preventing evictions on a public health basis. That runs out at the end of the year. So we're kind of waiting to see if those things are addressed too. I mean, we still have, as many people have said, we have a long, potentially dark winter to get through before the vaccine is widely available. That's just the immediate. And to your point about the long term, I think it just, again, illuminates the inequalities in wealth, in opportunity, in education, and so forth that have become worse in this country, and that need to be addressed.
During the forbearance for both renters and mortgage payers, the balance keeps accruing.
Correct.
Yes, the first arrives and you don't have to send out a check, so you can still buy food and pay your heat bill, but the balance is piling up. Is it happening at such a scale that even if things can get back to normal in May or June, some of the potential economic recovery will be dampened by the fact that families will have plowed themselves under implied debt and will have no equivalent rise in wages to cover that new lump of unhandled, unaddressed debt to their landlord, to their banks?
It could well be, and we may need to implement, mortgage modification programs, as we did in the crisis, and we learned in the financial crisis back in 2008-9. We learned a lot about how to do that by our mistakes. So we may see a need for those sorts of things where you restructure the mortgage so people can afford it. But it also just comes back to the importance of things like the $1,200 checks that were sent out of unemployment compensation, giving people, the resources they need. And those benefit all of us because people spend that money. And that helps the economy generally, and some people worry about the debt we're accumulating. Well, yes, we are, but interest rates are very low. And to not continue to provide assistance of that type while the pandemic is still going on is sort of like if we were in the middle of World War II and people said, these tanks and aircraft carriers it's really costing a lot of money. I mean, maybe we should just stop. And, if Hitler wins, Hitler wins. I mean, it's almost kind of like that. This is not a time to worry about the debt. This is a time to help people get through this, to get the virus under control, and then we will deal with federal debt.
Well, 2,000 to 3,000 people a day are dying. The number of new infections is just staggering. The line is going to be a long one to finally get a vaccine. So some of this is a confidence building exercise as much as a public health one. People want to be confident about getting on a subway again. People want to be confident about walking into a department store again.
Right.
If you had to design some programs that address where we'll be early in 2021, what's the sort of cavalry coming over the hill part of this? How do you address the needs of families in the most dire need until we can get vaccines into people's arms at scale?
Right. I think it's a combination of things. I mean, it's one, we do have, say, in the nutrition programs, we do have in some of those automatic provisions that increase the amount of money available, but we're still faced with, food banks being overwhelmed. We've got to make sure people have enough food. So, I think it's a combination of unemployment compensation, direct payments, potentially, again, another round of those, making sure we've adequately funded nutrition programs and food banks, and then doing more in the way of trying to contain the virus as best we can through testing, through masks, through whatever other message means we can come up with, so that we can reopen more schools. I mean, that's important, not just so that we don't have people, particularly again on the lower rungs of the economic ladder, who aren't doing very well with this remote learning situation we're in, but it's also important for families. If schools are open safely, then people can more easily do their jobs. So it's those types of things. Congress is debating liability protection for businesses. The Republicans want that. I hate to see that issue hold things up. I mean, there haven't been a wave of lawsuits about that. I grant that there's some concern there, and maybe we should do something, but we've got to pass some sort of measure that provides additional relief to people, so that we can get through this winter.
In just a few minutes, we'll be turning it over to you for your questions. So be thinking of something sharp, wonderful, elegant to put to Tim. We'll be going to that in just a few minutes. Are we going to be dealing with the consequences of this far, in a sense, almost an economic expression of how the pandemic itself has hung in longer than people were talking about in February? Will we be dealing with the economic consequences of this longer than I think we're thinking about now and
I
talking
think
about
we
now?
will be. I mean, the estimates are it will take us a few years to recover the job losses. Again, a lesson from the financial crisis was, uh, there's a much greater risk of not doing enough than there is of doing too much. When we look back at the financial crisis and say, well, the stimulus we passed then was $800 billion. I mean, that's almost like small change compared to the measures we're dealing with today. And that was a tough fight. And it was scaled at 800 billion because we thought in the Obama administration we couldn't get any more than that. And then when we tried to do additional stimulus, that was blocked. Uh, I think that was one reason the economic recovery was as, kind of moderate. Some people would say slow. We did recover, but it took time. Now, other people would say, well, it's because there was too much regulation of business or whatever. There are different theories, I'll grant that. But I think the main thing is, let's not make the mistake again of doing too little. Much better to do more, because given the extent of the damage, we really do face a challenge. And also, it's not like things are going to go right back to normal. The job market is getting restructured. The way we do work is changing. Some of the jobs that have been lost will not come back. We were already in a situation where we kind of had a bit of a hollowing out of employment in this country, where people who have college degrees and post-college degrees have lots of opportunities, but those that don't are kind of facing declining opportunities. So we needed to address that anyway. But you're right. That's going to be part of the long-term challenge of recovering from this.
There are anti-interventionists, people who say, look, if people lose their house, other families will buy the house at a more competitive price. If your business closes, that empty restaurant will be, a new restaurant will open in its place that will address the needs of the community going forward. Government doesn't have to be involved in this at all. They seem at peace with a painful, perhaps even protracted, but economically rational way of dealing with all this? Is that politically possible?
I I don't see it. I just think the scale of this is so great, and the people again who are suffering the most, you know, it's hardly their fault. Um, Plus, as a government, I think we have not done nearly the job we needed to do to try to manage the virus so that people could continue their jobs. You look at other societies, particularly some of the Asian countries, China, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, as well as Australia and New Zealand. They've done a much better job of managing this, so that a lot of businesses could remain open, so that schools could remain open, and so that you maybe didn't need as much government assistance as we otherwise do. I would have loved to have seen that happen, but we didn't do that. Mask wearing became politicized. We didn't use the authorities that the government has to make sure we produced enough testing, enough tests, enough PPE, protective equipment, supplies for hospitals. There were ways to do that. There's something called the Defense Production Act that was not aggressively used by the Trump administration. I will give them credit for Operation Warp Speed on the vaccine front. That, clearly what's happened on the vaccine front has surprised all of us and has been terrific. But, again, we needed to do much more to manage this until those vaccines are widely available.
Enter the chat function below to add your questions for Tim Massad. And now I hand it all over to Molly Reynolds. Thanks.
Thanks, Ray. And thanks for those great questions. I have, again, the challenge and privilege of trying to harness all of your great questions for our speaker. Where I'd like to start is a sort of specific follow-up, Tim, about what you mentioned about the eviction moratorium.
Yeah.
So there's a question about whether that can be extended without a change in the law. There are a number of folks in the chat who are interested in sort of what about the coming wave of eviction. So I'll start there.
So the agency that oversees Fannie and Freddie, the two GSEs, has extended the forbearance or the foreclosure moratorium, excuse me. They have extended the foreclosure moratorium until, as they said, at least January 31st. And I would expect that Fannie and Freddie will continue to extend that foreclosure moratorium under the Biden administration. So that will help a lot. Again, that represents mortgages that are owned or guaranteed by Fannie and Freddie. That's a lot of the mortgages in this country. It's not all mortgages, but it tends to represent quite a lot of the mortgages that are not the higher end mortgages. So that will help. But 35% of the people in this country rent. So I assume the CDC, issued their order that prohibited evictions of renters on a public health basis. I'm assuming they can extend that. I'm not an expert on that, but I would hope that could be extended also. As Ray pointed out earlier, you still owe the money, and we've still got to help figure out ways for people to pay that. And of course, we've also got to keep our eye on what happens up the chain here. If people don't pay their mortgage or their rent, then you do have issues in the financial system with the companies that service those mortgages, that collect those payments. You've got to make sure that that doesn't trigger financial strain, as was the case in the financial crisis. So we'll have to keep our eye on that as well.
Thanks, Tim. The next question I want to ask comes from Gabby, who says, I'm assuming that fixing systemic racism as it relates to finances and the economy will take a multi-pronged approach. What are the top 3 short-term measures and top 3 long-term actions that could help alleviate the sort of structural inequalities that we see in the economy?
Well, I think the top 3 immediate measures are extending unemployment compensation, probably doing another round of direct payments, and probably assistance to state and local governments. We haven't talked about that. That's one of the issues being debated in Congress. And of course, the issue there is that state and local government revenues are being badly affected by the economic recession. There's a lag in the appearance of that, just because, you know, a recession hits and then you pay your taxes later, and so it hits the budget later. But those, you know, the forecast is for, you know, something on the order of a $500 billion shortfall in state and local government funding, and that means cuts in you know, important government services. So we've got to address that as well, and that's one of the things that Congress is debating now. You know, in terms of long-term, you know, it's things like addressing educational opportunity and infrastructure, and frankly, tax reform, having a more equitable tax system where, you know, maybe we expand the earned income tax credit and other kinds of credits that benefit people on the lower end of the economic scale, and we tax the wealthier a little bit more, so that we can afford the types of investments we need to be making in infrastructure and education.
Great, thanks. Next question is about from Carol Graves, and it's about the unemployment numbers. And she writes, unemployment numbers, as great as they are, don't really reflect the scale of those without jobs. What's the real scope? Who is not included in the numbers? Best guess on what the true picture is.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I'm not enough of an expert to give you the precise answer, but you're right that those numbers don't probably reflect everything. They don't pick up the people who have dropped out of looking. And obviously some people have had to drop out of looking for a job, either because it was just too hard to find anything, or because their kids are at home now that schools are closed, and they've got to take care of their kids, so they can't work. There are different estimates on, you know, what that true number is, but I probably shouldn't venture a guess as to what it is.
There are a couple of questions, Tim, about the sort of design of a next round of relief between, and sort of the trade-off between an unemployment insurance extension and more economic impact payments for everyone, even if they haven't lost wages. Can you talk a little bit about kind of that trade-off, what your views are of the sort of extending targeted unemployment insurance versus broad-based payments?
Sure. There are different views on that. The what was initially termed the problem solvers caucus package, which the problem solvers is a group of Republican and Democratic representatives and senators who came together to propose this $908 billion package, which I showed a summary of earlier. They focused on unemployment compensation. They did not include another round of direct payments because I think they felt, well, that's going to the people that, you know, need the money the most, the people that aren't getting any income from unemployment. The Trump administration then proposed a package, a $916 billion package that had another round of direct payments to individuals, but no unemployment compensation. You know, I think on the theory that, well, they liked the idea of sending out checks to everyone, or at least, you know, about half of Americans. You do pick up those people who maybe aren't filing for unemployment claims for whatever reason. I, you know, pick one or the other. My view is just pass something. I would probably prefer the unemployment route, but I would just like to see Congress act. Again, I think you know, we're really in a situation where this is very urgent, and we need to act.
Thanks. Another question that raises is about kind of systemic inequality, and the Black and Native American communities have been raising issues of systemic inequality for a long time. How do we move beyond thinking about the stock market and home ownership to bring their perspectives clearly into the national dialogue and into the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, good, excellent question. Well, you know, I think there is an increasing attention to that. I think the events of the last year have certainly brought greater attention to issues of racial justice and racial disparities in wealth and opportunity. Those are not easy problems to tackle, and they're, you know, it's not like there's a quick fix to those problems. I think we have, I mean, Janet Yellen, I think, is someone who's thought a lot about these issues, and, you know, she's a labor market economist by training. And I think she's very attuned to issues of the challenges that people on the lower rungs of the economic ladder, Black and Hispanic workers, as well as white workers without college degrees, are facing. I think it's a panoply of measures that we have to be looking at to help those people, and it's you know, again, it's not going to be something we can fix quickly, but we need to be making it a much greater priority.
Right, there are a couple of questions here that connect some of these economic issues to other policy areas. And the first one I want to raise is, are there particular elements of the Green New Deal that you think would help provide jobs for those who are currently unemployed?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Green New Deal. You know, I should have said at the beginning, you know, it's always a risk at St. Columbus talking about anything, because there's undoubtedly people in the congregation who know a lot more about whatever it is you're talking about than you do, and I'm sure that's true today. I probably, instead of you know, answering questions, should invite those people with the expertise. Molly, you're one of them. To comment on some of these questions, but particularly I think on the Green New Deal. Look, I mean, you know, clearly we can create some jobs in alternative energy, and that's a good thing. I think the Biden administration will be focused on that. But I'm not enough of an expert in that area to give you more than a kind of a newspaper level answer.
So one additional question that is a little bit back more firmly in the economic sphere is a question about restoring manufacturing in America. We hear a lot about this, particularly in the Midwest. Is that the answer that many believe it to be? How do we do that if it is?
Well, you know, I think it's hard to buck the tide of what's happened globally. You know, and one of the main things that's happened, of course, is that a lot of manufacturing has moved offshore, but also a lot of office work has moved offshore, and the driver of that is a very simple one, and it was that, you know, the wage rates in this country were much higher than in other countries. And as those other countries improved, as their economies improved, as their educational attainment levels improved, and as capital became more mobile and as technology allowed for the transfer of information seamlessly and in a second, you could move jobs overseas. And, you know, this is one of the themes that John Sides and I, when we did a thing on inequality a while back, talked about was, you know, if you look at inequality in the US, it's dramatically increased. If you look at it globally, the picture has gotten much better. We've lifted billions of people out of poverty because of these trends. So, you know, that's a long-winded way of saying I don't think you can fundamentally alter that course, but that doesn't mean that you can't find new ways of retraining people and enabling them to have more skills and, you know, in the economy we have today. Now, again, those aren't easy things to do. Retraining programs are quite difficult to make work, but, you know, that's the kind of thing that we've got to be looking at and got to really make a serious commitment to, so that we don't continue to have this hollowing out of economic opportunity.
Great, thank you, Tim. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. That brings us to our time for Q&A. Again, I really appreciate everyone's thoughtful submissions, and I'm going to turn it over to Ledley to close us in prayer.
Then before I pray, I want to say a special thank you to you, Tim, for your thoughtfulness and your preparation. And it's really a treat for, I think I can speak for all of us, saying what a treat it is for all of us to have you share your wisdom and your perspective with us in this way. So thank you for that. And we're grateful. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh, gracious God, you have planted in our hearts and in our minds a vision of your beloved community, a community of justice and mutual responsibility, in which the least in this and in every society are uplifted and supported, a vision in which there is an abundance for all. We pray that you pour out your wisdom upon the leaders of this nation and all in authority around the world, that they may take steps that lead us toward that beloved community. We pray that you pour out your love and your mercy upon those in great need this day, those who are feeling at the breaking point, those who are without, and those who are hungry and homeless. And finally, dear God, we pray that you pour out your love and your wisdom upon each of us gathered here today, that each of us in our own ways and together may find steps that we can take to be part of building that beloved community today and throughout our days. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Since I have the microphone, I'll say thank you to one and all.
Fun to everybody.